For over 2 centuries, a small island off the coast of Nova Scotia has consumed money, equipment, and human lives while revealing almost nothing in return. 6 men have lost their lives chasing whatever is buried beneath it. Fortunes have been poured into its ground like water vanishing into sand. Presidents, actors, and everyday dreamers have all stood beside a flooded hole in the earth and wondered the same thing people have been asking since 1795. And now, if the whispers emerging from that island are true, the longest-running treasure hunt in human history may finally be approaching the only conclusion it was ever meant to reach. An ending even more bizarre than the legend that started it all, because what recent surveys have pulled from the depths of Oak Island is not merely gold, jewels, or the pirate treasure the stories have promised. It is something that, according to the men who uncovered it, should not be there at all. And once you understand what they claim to have found, you may have a harder time sleeping tonight than you expected. This is the story of Oak Island. The real story. Not the fireside version, but the documented, excavated, drilled into truth. And the modern discovery that has more people than ever believing the impossible could be buried beneath those trees. To understand why grown men have devoted their entire lives to a patch of forest barely a mile long, you have to return to a summer afternoon in 1795 to a teenage boy named Daniel McGinnis. The story, as it has been handed down and mostly supported by the earliest written records, begins simply enough. McGinnis was exploring the eastern end of the island, a wild, uninhabited place at the time, covered with red oaks that gave the island its name, when he spotted something that didn't belong in untouched wilderness. There was a clearing, a circular hollow in the ground, perhaps 13 feet wide, as though the earth itself had settled after being disturbed and then filled in again. And directly above that hollow, hanging from the cut-off branch of an old oak tree, was an ancient ship's tackle block, a pulley, the kind of heavy iron and wooden equipment used to lift enormous weights. Now, imagine yourself standing in that boy's shoes. This was a coastline filled with legend. Everyone around the region knew the tales, that pirates from the Golden Age, men like Captain Kidd, had sailed these waters, and that Kidd himself was rumored to have buried a fortune somewhere along the Atlantic coast before his execution. And here was a young man standing above a sunken pit beneath a tree that had obviously been used to lower something heavy into the earth. The conclusion seemed obvious. McGinnis went home, gathered 2 friends, John Smith and Anthony Vaughan, and the 3 boys returned the following day carrying picks and shovels, convinced they were about to become unimaginably wealthy. They began digging, and almost immediately the island started showing them that it had been deliberately engineered. 2 feet down, they struck a layer of flagstones, flat quarried rock that does not naturally occur on the island and would have needed to be transported there. Beneath those stones, the pit walls showed obvious scoring from pickaxes, tool marks left by people who had dug this same shaft long before. They continued. At 10 feet, their shovels hit timber. A solid platform made from oak logs fitted into the sides of the shaft and covered with a layer of heavy clay. They pulled it upward, hearts racing, expecting to see gold shining underneath. Instead, there was more dirt. And another 10 feet farther down, another oak platform. And 10 feet beneath that, another one, layer after intentional layer, each positioned by human hands, each acting like a floor sealing away whatever was waiting below. The 3 boys dug until they simply couldn't continue, until the shaft became too deep and dangerous for 3 teenagers using hand tools. But they never forgot what they had discovered. They had felt it in their muscles and witnessed it with their own eyes. Someone had gone to an extraordinary, almost unimaginable amount of trouble to bury something on this island and to make completely certain that nobody could easily retrieve it. You don't construct a shaft with evenly spaced oak platforms to hide a handful of coins. You build something like that to protect something valuable for a very, very long time. Years went by. The boys grew into men. And around 1804, a serious expedition came back. The Onslow Company funded and organized with the equipment and workforce the boys had never possessed, and this is where the Oak Island story stops being an entertaining local legend and becomes something genuinely technically puzzling. The Onslow diggers followed the original shaft downward, passing platform after platform. Exactly as the boys had reported, every 10 ft another layer of oak. But now they were discovering other materials trapped between those layers. A layer of charcoal, a coating of putty, a thick bed of coconut fiber. Coconut fiber on an island off Nova Scotia, hundreds of miles from any place where coconuts have ever naturally grown. Someone had transported coir across the ocean to reinforce this shaft, and then, at around 90 ft below the surface, they discovered the object that would haunt treasure seekers for the next 200 years. A flat stone, unlike anything else, carved with strange markings. A coded set of symbols that nobody there could understand. According to the surviving accounts, the stone was eventually translated, or supposedly translated, into one incredibly tempting sentence. 40 ft below, 2 million pounds are buried. Whether that translation was ever genuine or whether it was a later addition placed into the legend remains one of the many questions still debated today. But the men of 1804 didn't need a translation to continue digging. They were 90 ft beneath the ground, looking at a coated stone, convinced that the treasure was almost close enough to touch. They levered the stone free and continued downward. And then the island delivered its masterstroke. As darkness approached, the diggers tested the mud at the bottom of the shaft with an iron bar and hit something solid, a hard horizontal surface covering the entire width of the pit. Wood, they assumed, a chest, the treasure chest. They decided to stop for the night and bring it up the following morning, and they went to sleep believing they were already rich. When they came back at sunrise, the pit was filled with 60 ft of water. They baled, pumped, and exhausted themselves working, but the water level refused to fall even an inch because this wasn't groundwater slowly leaking into an ordinary hole. It returned as quickly as they removed it, maintaining almost exactly the level of the sea. And it took years and several more failed expeditions before anyone realized the terrifying brilliance of what they were fighting. The pit had been deliberately trapped. Whoever created it had also constructed a hidden system of channels, flood tunnels, stretching hundreds of feet from the shaft all the way to the ocean at a location now known as Smith's Cove, where an artificial beach had been built to function as a massive filter pulling seawater inland. Dig too far, break through the barrier, and the Atlantic itself would rush into the shaft and destroy the effort. The treasure, if there truly was one, wasn't protected by a simple lock, but by the entire ocean. That one discovery transformed everything about the way people would eventually understand Oak Island. This wasn't an ordinary burial site. A person hiding valuables digs a hole, places a chest inside, and covers it. What existed beneath this stretch of rough forest was something completely different. An engineering project requiring time, planning, labor, and a mind capable of imagining three-dimensional structures beneath the ground. Someone had studied the tides. Someone had calculated the distance between the cove and the shaft. Someone had covered a beach with layers of stone, eelgrass, and coconut fiber so it could work like a giant sponge, allowing seawater to travel inland through channels invisible from above. And presumably, all of it had been created to protect whatever was waiting at the bottom of that flooded shaft. The men of 1804 left defeated and confused. But the island had done something even more powerful than beating them. It had convinced them that every barrier it presented only made their belief stronger that something extraordinary was hidden below. Normal dirt doesn't fight back, and so the legend moved from one generation to another, collecting money, weight, and desperation along the way. Fathers told their sons, investors created companies, and every new team arrived on that windswept shore believing they had the intelligence the previous group had lacked. In 1849, another expedition attempted a different strategy. Instead of reopening the entire shaft, they drilled. Using a pod auger similar to those used for coal exploration, they bored downward into the collapsed flooded pit, hoping to recover a sample of whatever remained at the bottom. And according to the surviving accounts, the drill passed through a spruce platform, then an empty space, then a layer of what the workers called loose metal in pieces, followed by more wood, more metal, more spruce, and finally clay. Loose metal in pieces. To the men turning that auger by hand, there was only one possible meaning for those words. Coins. Chests filled with coins. So many coins that the drill had apparently passed directly through a heap of them. And then came the detail repeated around countless campfires ever since. As the auger came back up, someone claimed they saw, stuck in the mud on the tool, 3 tiny links from a gold chain. Whether they were genuinely gold, whether they had ever truly existed, whether the story was misunderstood or embellished through years of retelling, nobody can say today. The links disappeared into the mist of the legend just like everything else. But the possibility of them was enough. Gold, real gold, supposedly pulled from the depths. From that point onward, Oak Island was no longer simply a local mystery. It had become a national obsession, and before long, an international one. The decades that came next read like a record of human stubbornness crashing into the same unstoppable water. Company after company arrived. They sank new shafts beside the original, hoping to tunnel across and reach the treasure from the side beyond the flood's reach. The island answered by collapsing their tunnels and swallowing their pumps. In one attempt, the entire bottom of the works collapsed and dropped, and the searchers became convinced that the treasure chamber itself had fallen even deeper, slipping away from them into the flooded darkness. They tried to block Smith's Cove and destroy the flood system at its source, only to discover not one channel, but signs of several. An entire hidden circulatory network supplying the pits with its endless water. They tried dynamite. They tried steam-powered pumps that would have impressed any mine in the country. They poured fortunes into the sand, savings, inheritances, the money of trusting strangers convinced by the story of those 3 gold links. And the island took every bit of it and returned nothing except deeper holes, dirtier water, and the occasional maddening fragment. A scrap of parchment pulled up on a drill bit with a few letters of ink still readable. A piece of shaped wood. A fragment of chain, just enough every time to keep the fire alive, never enough to finish the search. By the beginning of the 20th century, the original money pit had been dug and dug again so many times, crossed by so many competing shafts that nobody could say for certain where it had even been. The exact spot that Daniel McGinnis had cleared beneath his oak with a boy's excitement in 1795 was buried inside a wrecked landscape of collapsed tunnels and flooded spaces. The searchers had, in a cruel twist, destroyed the very landmark they had come to exploit. And still, they returned. The story took its darkest turn in 1965. A man had invested in the dream, convinced that the flood tunnels could finally be defeated if only the pumping power was strong enough. He was pumping water from one of the shafts, using a gasoline engine to run the pump, when something went wrong in the pit below. Fumes, most likely, the exhaust sinking invisibly into the shaft. He climbed down or was overcome and never came back up. Others went down after him to rescue him, one after another, and were overcome as well. When it was over, 4 men were dead at the bottom of Oak Island, killed by the same obsession with the pit that had pulled everyone there before them. The island now had a death toll. And the local story of the old curse, the prophecy that 7 men had to die before the treasure would reveal itself, suddenly didn't sound like folklore. It sounded like mathematics. 6 men have died on Oak Island searching. 6 of the 7 the legend demands. That number hangs over the island like a storm cloud. So this was the mystery as it stood for 2 entire centuries. A pit that fought back, an ocean turned into a guardian, coconut fiber carried across the sea, a coated stone, 3 mysterious links of gold, and a growing toll of dead men. And beneath all of it, the question that no amount of money or machinery could solve. Who? Who had the resources and the intelligence to construct a flood-protected vault beneath an insignificant island off the coast of Nova Scotia long before the region was settled? And what could possibly have been valuable enough to justify all that work? Every generation had its own answer, and every answer became another dead end. Some blamed the pirates of the Golden Age, especially Captain Kidd, who was hanged in London in 1701 and whose supposed treasure was rumored to be buried somewhere on an island in the western Atlantic. Kidd had sailed those waters. He had, according to his desperate claims during his trial, hidden wealth to bargain for his life. It was easy and exciting to imagine that fortune lying beneath the oaks. But pirates, generally speaking, did not create engineering masterpieces. They buried treasure and escaped. Nothing about the complexity of the flood tunnels fit a fugitive with only a few weeks and a nervous crew. Others went further back and into stranger territory. Some insisted the pit had been built by the Knights Templar. The medieval warrior monks hunted almost to extinction in the early 14th century. Their leaders were burned. Their fleet disappeared from the harbor at La Rochelle. What if that fleet had sailed west, centuries before Columbus, carrying the Order's legendary treasure, or something even more valuable, to a hiding place at the edge of the known world? It was a spectacular theory, and it depended on almost nothing except the hope that it might be true. Others quietly repeated the name of Francis Bacon, the English philosopher and statesman, along with one of the oldest and most tempting literary conspiracies, that Bacon had secretly written the plays credited to William Shakespeare, and that the original manuscripts, the evidence of the greatest deception in literary history, had been sealed in mercury and buried somewhere no rival could ever reach. Bacon was known to have studied techniques for preserving documents in liquid, and traces of mercury had reportedly been found in the mud recovered from the pit. For believers, that was enough. A vault of manuscripts beneath Oak Island would not simply be treasure. It would rewrite the authorship of the English language itself. And some allowed the theories to wander completely off the map, talking about the lost Ark of the Covenant, Marie Antoinette's jewels secretly carried across the Atlantic during the French Revolution by a loyal servant, Aztec gold, and Viking hordes. Every theory came with its believers, its pamphlets, and its certainty. Each one explained the pit for a while and then fell apart against the same stubborn fact: nobody had ever reached the bottom. Every theory was a story told about a locked room that no one had managed to open. The island took the treasure hunters' money, their years, and in 6 cases their lives, while giving back nothing but uncertainty. A stone nobody could decipher, a gold link nobody could weigh, a hint of parchment caught on a mechanical hook. For 200 years, Oak Island remained a mystery that grew bigger the longer anyone studied it. If you're still with us this far down the shaft, take a moment to subscribe. Because what modern searchers discovered when they finally stopped digging blindly and started listening to the ground itself is where this story changes. Because this is what changed. For 2 centuries, every attempt on Oak Island had been the same basic attempt wearing different clothes. Men chose a spot, and they dug. When water appeared, they dug faster or moved somewhere else. They were fighting the island on the island's terms, in complete darkness, guessing at what existed below their feet. They had no way to see through the earth. They could only rip it open and hope. That is why the pit won every time. You cannot outdig an ocean when you don't even know where that ocean is coming from. Then, the technology changed. Over the last 2 decades, a new generation arrived on Oak Island carrying instruments the earlier searchers could never have imagined. Ground-penetrating radar, which sends energy pulses into the soil and measures the echoes bouncing back from buried structures. Seismic surveys that map cavities and changes in density far beneath the surface. Sonar lowered into flooded boreholes to reveal the shape of chambers no diver could safely reach. Core drilling that brought up thin, untouched cylinders of soil from 150 feet below, layer by careful layer, allowing geologists to read the ground the way a doctor reads an X-ray. For the first time in the island's history, searchers could look before they dug. They could ask the earth a question and receive an answer that wasn't a dead body. And the earth began answering. The core samples delivered the first shock. Drills brought up wood from depths where natural wood should never exist. Worked timber, cut and positioned by human hands at levels that scientific testing suggested were centuries old. In one sample, there were tiny traces of what laboratory testing identified as gold, microscopic but present, rising from the deep darkness inside a thread of clay. Not a chest, not a coin, but evidence, or something very close to it, that gold had moved through that ground and left its dust behind. In another sample, recovered from far below, there were pieces of what appeared to be human bone, and beside them a scrap of parchment. Real parchment, sheepskin prepared for writing with a few marks of ink still visible. A laboratory examined the parchment and confirmed that it was genuine and old. Someone, sometime in the distant past, had carried a written document deep into the earth beneath Oak Island. The whisper on the mechanical hook a century earlier had not been completely imaginary after all. Then the scans discovered the voids. Deep inside the flooded maze of old shafts and natural cavities, sonar and seismic surveys began outlining open spaces, cavities within the bedrock, some clearly cut, others perhaps natural, but shaped in ways that made the geologists stop and think. In one area, the imaging appeared to show a tunnel running at an angle no natural flow of water would ever create, a passage that seemed to extend toward the sea exactly where the flood was always believed to begin. For the first time, the searchers were seeing the machine, not the treasure, the system that protected it. The very flood mechanism that had defeated every person who ever entered the pit, emerging from the darkness as ghostly gray echoes on a laptop screen. And then came the beach that shouldn't have been a beach. When the searchers stepped back and mapped the shoreline at Smith's Cove using the new technology, they confirmed what a few sharp-eyed hunters had suspected for years. The layers of coconut fiber and eelgrass, the drains spreading beneath the sand like the bones of a hand, the box-shaped structures buried below the tide line. These were not the remains of some forgotten fishing operation. Together they formed a system, a massive, deliberate filtering and channeling machine built to draw seawater inward and push it under pressure toward the pit. Someone had turned an entire cove into a valve, and its scale, the sheer amount of labor involved, told the searchers something earlier generations had only suspected. Whatever was buried at the bottom of Oak Island, its builders had been willing to move an entire beach to protect it. You don't turn the Atlantic Ocean into a burglar alarm for a chest of trinkets. Now the theories that once sounded like wild fantasies had to be judged against physical objects recovered from the ground. Real gold dust, real parchment, real worked timber at impossible depths, real bone, a real mapped flood system. The mystery had stopped being only a collection of stories about a locked room and had become a question of evidence, faint and frustrating and incomplete. But evidence all the same. And somewhere during the analysis of one of those core samples, inside a laboratory far from the island, a technician looked at what the instruments were showing and, according to people who were there, suddenly went quiet. Because the wood was not simply old, it was, the dating indicated, much older than any European settlement in that part of the New World. Older than the pirates, older, some claimed, than the entire neat timeline everyone had been relying on. And if that was true, then the question was no longer simply what had been buried on Oak Island. The question became who was already there to bury it at a time when the history books claimed there was nobody there at all. That single result, if it proved accurate, threatened to pull the entire story loose from every anchor it had ever been attached to. Kidd could not have built it. The Templars, despite all the romance surrounding the theory, appeared far too late. If the timber genuinely came before the accepted arrival of Europeans along that coast, then the shaft was not created by any of the familiar suspects. And the entire comfortable lineup of pirates and knights and escaping kings started to seem less like an explanation and more like a collection of stories people had chosen because the truth was simply too strange to accept. But this is exactly the point where a careful thinker has to slow down, because one core sample is not a final answer. Old wood can be reused wood, timber taken from a much older tree and only later carried into a pit. Contamination occurs. One date, unconfirmed, unpublished, passed quietly from a laboratory is a spark, not a sunrise. And the honest reality of Oak Island in this modern era is that for every mysterious gray echo appearing on a laptop screen, for every particle of gold and piece of parchment, there is another current pulling in the opposite direction. The searchers had not uncovered a vault. They had not raised a chest into daylight. What they had accomplished after more than 2 centuries of failure was something quieter and in its own way more remarkable. They had demonstrated that something below was created by human hands, deliberately, at enormous expense, and protected with engineering intelligence that still functions today. The warning still sounds. The water still returns. And so, the answer to the question in every headline, has the Oak Island treasure been discovered? Has the History Channel confirmed the find? Has to be stated directly because you deserve the truth more than you deserve the excitement. No, not in the way those words suggest. No network has stepped in front of the cameras and revealed a treasure hoard. No archaeologist has lifted the object from the bottom and identified it. What exists is a collection of genuine, physical, tested evidence. Gold traces, shaped timber, a documented flood system, human bone that has moved the mystery beyond pure legend and into the territory of something truly provably unusual. That is smaller than a treasure chest. It is also, when you really consider it, much more fascinating because you cannot counterfeit a beach transformed into a valve. You cannot invent coconut fiber inside a drain. Someone did that. Someone real with real hands for a real purpose we still do not completely understand. Why did we not discover this earlier? The temptation is to reach for conspiracy, to claim powerful people buried the truth alongside the treasure, to picture a hand pushing the record closed. But the real reasons are quieter and ultimately more tragic. The reason is water. The flood tunnels that destroyed every excavation and swallowed every clue before anyone could understand it. The reason is time, more than 2 centuries of shafts crossing shafts, collapses burying collapses until the original location became a churned wound where no clean layer remained. The reason is greed and impatience, early searchers who wanted the treasure, not the explanation, and who ruined the evidence while racing to reach it. And the reason is money, simple and unremarkable, the funding that disappears, the seasons that finish, the equipment that breaks. The island never needed a cover-up. It had the Atlantic Ocean, human impatience, and its own brutal design. That was always sufficient. The skeptics have their argument, and it is a powerful one. There are respected experts who examine every discovery and see the leftovers of the search itself: gold from a lost coin, wood from an earlier excavation, bone that might have washed in or been buried through the ordinary ways humans bury things over centuries. Extraordinary claims, they remind us, need extraordinary evidence, and a fragment is not a fortune. They correctly point out that not one artifact has yet declared clearly and beyond debate, this is what this was built for. And the believers respond equally reasonably that you do not construct a flood tunnel to protect nothing, that you do not engineer an entire cove for amusement, that the labor itself is evidence that whatever lies below was valuable enough to justify an army of shovels and the sweat of men whose names have disappeared. Both sides are examining the same gray echoes. Both sides are, in their own way, correct about what they can observe and mistaken about what they cannot. So, this is where the story genuinely stands, stripped of the exaggeration and the noise. The searchers discovered the machine but not the prize. They discovered the builder's fingerprints but not the builder's identities. They found enough to show that the legend has a backbone of solid fact running through it, and not enough to explain what the legend was ever truly about. The oldest question on that island remains unanswered, but it is unanswered in a different way now, supported by parchment and gold dust and dated timber instead of merely by campfire stories. The boundary between myth and history has shifted. It has not disappeared. And perhaps that is the real treasure of Oak Island, not a chest filled with coins, but the stubborn human refusal to leave a locked door untouched. For more than 200 years, men have poured their fortunes, their time, and, in 6 cases, their lives into a hole in the earth because they could not tolerate not knowing. Something beneath that ground was designed to protect a secret, and something inside us was created that cannot tolerate a hidden secret. Those two forces have been fighting on a small island off Nova Scotia for longer than most nations have existed, and the conflict is not finished. The water still rises, the tunnel still points toward the ocean, and somewhere beneath the disturbed earth. Whatever was valuable enough to justify all of this remains there, waiting as patiently as ever, for the one excavation that finally reads the answer before the flood can steal it away again. So, now the question belongs to you. Look at everything they have recovered from that ground, the worked timber beneath the reach of any tide, the gold that should not be there. The flood system designed by someone who wanted the outside world kept away, the wood that dated earlier than the entire story we were taught. Do you believe the searchers are getting closer to a genuine treasure that history simply misplaced? Something real that careful hands buried and clever hands protected? Or do you believe Oak Island is a 200-year echo chamber where every generation discovers exactly the mystery it came searching for and calls the remains of the previous excavation a clue? And if you had the equipment and the money and one season on that island, where would you dig? And would you dare to be the person standing at the bottom when the water arrived? Tell me below. And if you want to be there when the next layer finally surrenders what it has been hiding, subscribe, because this story is nowhere near finished.